This is the story of me as a genocide survivor. Start off, okay. I'm going to kick off the Getting to Know Me series, and I've decided to create the series to really just delve deeper into different parts of my life, so you will start to really get to know me. And I think this first series we're going to start off with is my story as a genocide survivor. You know, I've shared this story in different platforms, and I think I have to start from here, you know. Without context to this, nothing else can kind of fall into place. So I'm Kurdish. A little bit of history about Kurds. We are one of the largest ethnic groups without a nation state, and there's a lot of history to that. So when the states were developed in the Middle East, you had the Ottoman Empire that was broken up and country states that were developed. And Kurds are right in the middle of, we're indigenous to the region, we're right in the middle of Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey. And when they were developing the nation states, what they did was they completely forgot Kurds. Like, I mean, completely. So what we were carved up between these four states and forced to kind of go under these states. And there's a lot of persecution against Kurds from these four different states. And even though we've all got different experiences of persecution from these states, I think what unifies Kurds is our sense of struggle and persecution. And I'm Kurdish from the Iraqi part, and I was born in the 1980s under Saddam Hussein's rule, and it was during the Iran and Iraq war. So you had the Iran and Iraq war happening, but you also had I'd say the conflict and war and genocide and persecution from Saddam Hussein against the Kurds. And my father was a political activist, but he was also a writer. He was a freedom fighter, a Peshmerga, but he also had a pen, and that pen would write poetry. So he was I guess a freedom fighter with a pen. He had two forms of a gun, which was his pen that was writing poetry, but also fighting as part of the cause and defending the Kurdish Kurds. And the way that Saddam Hussein would persecute men like him or families like him would be to capture their families. You know, in my childhood, I don't really remember my dad being with us a lot. He would often be in the mountains, he would be away from the family, he'd be in hiding. So my mum was very much a single mum, looking after me and my older brother with my extended family, so my grandparents, uncles, auntie. And my dad would come and visit, but would always be in hiding in secret because he was wanted by Saddam Hussein. The way that it started was my mum, so I remember this quite clearly, my mum used to work at that time, and if ever she sneaked off to see my dad secretly, you know, she'd take time off from work and she would be interrogated by the secret police when she'd go back into work. You know, they'd try and find out where she'd been and who she'd gone to see. In short, to find out if she was with my dad and if she had any information. So I think this had kind of taken its toll on her, and she decided that she was going to leave work, so she left work. And a day after she left work, the secret police turned up to our house, and we were at my grandparents' house, so her parents' house, my maternal grandparents. And that particular day I was playing in the garden and I heard like a loud thud on the garden gate, which really startled me, and I remember freezing. And I waited for an adult to come out, so I didn't really move until an adult came out, and my uncle came running out and went towards the gate, and I ran towards him for safety, thinking it was actually family members that were coming to visit us, or I don't know. But you know, as a child, you just run to an adult for safety, and that's how I ran to him. I stood in front of him, and as he opened the garden gates, there stood two like Iraqi soldiers, and they looked down at me and he looked at them and tried to deter them because he knew what they were there for. And so he said, to try and deter them, oh, they asked for my mum, and he said, oh, she's left him, meaning my dad, because of this child, and kind of patted me on the head. And they looked down at me and went, oh, so this is the enemy's child. And at that point, he realised that there was no going back, and he'd revealed that I was the child, and I could almost feel my uncle's hand tense up. So I was really worried at what was to come. They persisted to ask for my mum, and they said that we're just going to take her in for questioning. She'll come back, there's no problems, but they were very, very like stern and angry and quite demanding from it. So my mum came out and they took her, and as they were taking her, they kind of put their hand on my back and pushed me as well and said, we'll take her as well. Now, I was 4 years old at the time, and all the adults just screamed and wailed, like begged them not to take me because I was a 4-year-old child. They didn't listen, and actually they threatened all the members of the family and said, if you follow the car, we'll shoot you instantly. So they couldn't even follow us to the car. I was taken with my mum to the car, and when they opened the doors, my paternal grandparents were there, so my dad's parents, and they just dropped to they dropped in the cars and begged the soldiers not to take me again, and the soldiers didn't listen. We were put in the cars and driven to what I would call like a normal prison. I say a normal prison because you had all sorts of criminals there, and I remember walking in, everyone was just staring, like just looking at us, wondering why we were there, why was there a child there, and they took us to a room where they interrogated the adults in front of me, and I remember being in the corner of the room sitting, just being as quiet as possible, and as a child somehow knew that I shouldn't really be talking because the adults were going through something, so I didn't really want to add to it. And that's the first time that I remember the sense of being invisible, because you had to be invisible. It was the safest thing in that moment. Something was happening, it wasn't good. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew it was dangerous. So being silent was the only way to kind of work with that. Anyway, they interrogated all the adults, and like my granddad, my grandmother, my mother, and they didn't give any information away. So we stayed there for a few hours, and then after a few hours they took us back into the car and started driving us. But this time on the way they picked up a 18-year-old boy who was blindfolded, and he kept saying, please don't kill me, what are you going to do to me? And at that time you had a lot of, especially men and young men and boys, just executed and killed. And my grandfather was trying to console him, to try and reassure him. I mean, there was not much that we could do, but just to try and, I guess he was trying to ease his pain. Anyway, they stopped the car and took him out, and we never saw him again. And I'm pretty certain that he was executed along with so many other boys and men. We ended up being driven to the prison, and I call it an ethnic prison because it was only Kurds. You had a women and children's quarters, and then you had the men's. So my grandfather was taken to the men's, and my grandmother, my mother and myself were taken to the women and children's quarters. And as a child, I remember coming out and looking at this building. It had really small windows, and everyone kind of came to the windows to see who was new and who was coming. We went in and it was absolutely packed. It was so packed. Like, so many women and children were in that building. But as a child, I remember seeing like the rooftop, which was like a courtyard area. the kids had somehow gone up to the rooftop area, which was caged, but I couldn't figure out how they'd got there because there was no stairs. So that's the first thing, like the first memory that I remember, like looking up and looking at these children and going, how did they get there? There's no stairs. And then because it was so packed and some people were in there for months, the space had become quite territorial. So my mum had a fight, like not a physical fight, but a shouting match with some of the women because they wouldn't give us space. And, you know, she had to fight for space for my grandmother and myself in another room so we could lie down. And that night, my mum slept sitting up because there wasn't enough space, but I slept with my grandmother lying down in one of the room areas. And particular things that I remember about that prison was the stench of urine. Like, I will never, even now, if I walk past a courtyard, like a alleyway or somewhere that has that stench, it takes me back to that prison. And it was such a strong smell, and that's because the bathroom was all open and there was no privacy, and you know, it was never cleaned, and you know, it was packed with women and children. So it really, really stenched. I remember not eating because of that smell. Like I would never eat. I think for the time that we were there, I was given enough to survive, but I couldn't physically eat properly because of that stench. And I remember it very clearly because it still makes me sick when I think about it. And I always wonder, did my, you know, Crohn's and gastro issues start from that moment? That's a story for another video. But anyway, we stayed there for, I'd say, about 3 weeks, and then after 3 weeks, some family names were called out, and we were on that list, and we actually thought we were going to be released. And there was some glimmer of hope, but we didn't really know what was going to happen. It's only when the adults were taken outside of the prison that the cries and the wails and the screams started, and they realised what was going to happen. I was too young to recognise what was going to happen, but I knew something bad was going to happen because of the way they reacted. Like the screams were so loud, and the reason was because in front of the buses that they were going to take us to, there was diggers, and in that time you had live burials, so a form of the torture and the way that they would commit some of the genocides. There were different ways that they would commit it, and one way was mass live burials. So we were going to be taken to be buried alive, and the adults knew this because seeing the diggers was part of that. What they would do is they'd make you see the diggers so you know that you're going to be buried alive. And they herd you on the buses, and then they make you witness the soil being, like the hole being dug with these diggers. And then they light everyone in alive and throw soil over you in really small pieces. Like they'd use a piece of cardboard or a small shovel. And that was meant to be a very slow, torturous death. So everything was very pre-planned in the way that they did it. So all the adults were screaming and crying and wailing, and we were herded onto these buses. And as soon as we were herded onto the buses, these cries and screams just turned into silent whispers of prayers. They were reciting the Quran, but really whispering it. There was an eerie stillness about the whole situation, because it's almost as if they'd accepted, okay, we're dying, and the last thing that we can do before we die is pray. You know, there's a lot more detail around that, but that's like a rough snapshot of that scenario. But what happened was, We were driven into the buses, and halfway through driving, something must have happened outside, and we don't know what, but a deal must have been made, because the drivers had switched. So the drivers that were driving our bus somehow had switched, and we didn't know this until the buses started driving again. And then when the buses stopped, these two men came and opened these doors, and they were Kurdish. And at that time, you had Kurdish people working for Saddam Hussein to rescue Kurds in situations like this, but you also had Kurds working for Saddam Hussein to basically actually working for Saddam Hussein, so to kill Kurds. And in this particular scenario, these two men were there to rescue us. So I'm almost like I wish I knew who these two men were, because I'd want them to see that the fact that they took that courageous step to rescue us and the impact it's had now. We don't know who they were, but they opened the doors and they said, "We're Kurdish, we're not going to kill you, but you need to disappear as if you're dead, because if you're caught again, you'll be killed on the spot." We don't know if those drivers are alive or what happened to them, but what they did is something that I'll never forget, and it's a big reason why we are alive. So we my grandfather, my grandmother, and my mother kind of regrouped, and we managed to make our way to a road, over a mountain. So we'd walked a bit and kind of found our way to a road, and my granddad stopped this taxi. And what was surreal about the situation was that this taxi was a former student of my granddad, and he was completely baffled. He just said, "What are you doing in the middle of nowhere with your family? Where are you going?" And at that time, you couldn't really tell anyone anything or tell anyone in detail what was going on. So he said, "Please don't ask any questions and just sneak us back into the city without anyone knowing." Now, we couldn't go back to my grandparents' house. I couldn't go back to my maternal grandparents' house, because it'll be most probably the first place that would be searched. So we were taken to my mum's stepsister's house, because it's the least likely place that would be searched if they were to find out. And so we were taken there, and when we walked in, everyone was wearing black. They were mourning and crying, and it was almost like we'd walked into our own funeral, because they'd had the message that we'd been buried alive. And for us to walk in alive, I don't even know what they would have thought and how they would have reacted. But to know that someone's been buried alive and then they walk through the door is completely surreal. But we'd had message from my dad, and the messages would be very underground, that we couldn't stay. So my mum had decided that she would take me, and we'd go to the south of Iraq in Diwania, which is an Arab populated region, but she had a stepbrother there. So we went to my uncle's house, and we stayed there in hiding for about 3 months. Now, as a child, I only spoke Kurdish. I didn't speak Arabic. I wasn't allowed out at all. I was literally put in hiding in the house, because had I gone out and spoken Kurdish, I would have given away the fact that we were Kurdish and then raised suspicion, and, might have been caught from that. So I wasn't allowed out, and I do remember, I think me and my cousins, I was going crazy. We'd have so many fights. But it was a very memorable moment as well, and I'll never really forget that. It's a time where I had an obsession with, we have this food in Kurdish, which is just fried tomatoes and eggs. I was absolutely obsessed with it, and my uncle would cook that for me every single day. Anyway, after 3 months, my mum had put her foot down and told my dad, "I'm not going to kill myself or my kids for you. We have to leave the country. You have to find a way for us to leave the country, because we can't stay in hiding. We've got the death threat on us, so there's no other way out." And eventually my dad agreed. That started the journey of, I'd say, fleeing, because what we did was we went from there and we picked up my older brother, and then we went from village to village in hiding. Now, this is during the Iran and Iraq war, so you had all the bombs being dropped in the rural regions, and actually the rural regions were the only safest place that we could go, strangely, because we couldn't go into the cities because we would have been targeted there a lot more. So the rural villages that had been deserted because of the Iran and Iraq war, but also attacks against Kurds and Kurdish villages. So we were going into these deserted villages, mostly with fighters there and other Peshmergas. And this was like for about 12 months this happened. So we'd go to one location. Sometimes we'd be forced to stay in one particular village because the bombardment of bombs and missiles was so heavy that we couldn't leave and we couldn't travel because it wasn't safe to do so. And in that journey, in those 12 months, I remember as children, we shouldn't really have seen and witnessed and experienced so many of those things, from, Peshmergas and fighters that were injured, and I mean severely injured, as in having their guts blown out, and just things that I personally cannot forget. But also the trauma of, the bomb dropping on you at any moment or being caught at any moment. Death was always around the corner. And so that happened for about 12 months. And eventually we were smuggled into Iran, and I remember it was nighttime and it was on horseback. So my mum and I were sharing a horse, and my brother was on another horse. And this guy was smuggling us into Iran. And at one point, the horse's hoof kind of dropped on the mountain. And when horses go, I remember clinging on to my mum for dear life because I thought I was going to fall off that mountain. Eventually, we were taken into Iran, and we arrived there, and some family friends had taken us in and were looking after us. But we were waiting for my dad to arrive. Now, in the meantime, my dad was still in the mountains and with other Peshmergas and freedom fighters. And Saddam Hussein had hired a husband and wife to poison a group of men. And he was part of that group. And, food's a massive thing in our culture. We'll lay out feeds, we'll overfeed you. Very hospitable, food is a big thing for us. And so when this husband and wife that were Kurdish laid out a massive feast for a group of freedom fighters and Peshmergas, nobody questioned anything because it's such a normal thing to do. But we have this yogurt drink, which is called mastal, and they'd put poison into that drink. So when they sat down and had the feast with them, they ate the food. And so nobody suspected anything, but they didn't drink the drink because they knew that the poison was in the drink. But the men that gulped down the drink, I think 2 men died on the spot, maybe even a young boy. And when they died on the spot, they realized, wait, we've been poisoned. And my dad and 2 other men were just critically declining, I'd say immediately after. And they were impacted critically. And so if they didn't get medical help, they would have died. So they were smuggled into Iran as well. And then eventually that night we were reunited, and I remember my dad being brought in, they were carrying him. He was so ill, his hair was falling out. And that night they monitored him, but then in the morning Amnesty International had found out about this story and had arranged to take my dad and the 2 other guys to be flown abroad for medical treatment. And that's where he was flown to the UK to get medical treatment. And I don't know if anyone remembers that Russian spy that was poisoned, Litvinenko. He basically looked like him. He ended up being in hospital for a few months. He was critically ill. He had lost all his hair, and we had to wait for him to survive before we could come over. We waited about a year, so by the time he survived and all our paperwork was ready, in the meantime, we were actually in Iran. So my mother, my brother, and myself were all in Iran waiting for the paperwork to come through. And at that time, I don't think there was a British embassy in Iran, because we had to fly to Syria to get our documents. And then from there, we flew to the UK. And so I arrived in the UK as a refugee at the age of 6. And I still remember that journey and that flight. But I'm going to leave that story for another video. So I hope that I can share what it was like to kind of arrive in the UK as a refugee, as a child who's experienced all of that in the next video. So we'll do the Getting to Know Me video with arriving here as a refugee in the next series. So if you'd like to hear more, if you'd like to be getting to know me a bit more and follow the other series, then please do subscribe, like, share, comment. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear it from you. You can write it in the comment section. But I hope that gives you some insight into my childhood, and it really shows when all the series is done, you kind of see why I do what I do. But that's my childhood.